Thank you ever so much.
Okay.
Yes, the notice just came up. Before we move on, Christian Gonzalez Rivera, our immediate past president, has a note from our current president who was unable to attend today.
Okay. Thank you, James. And thank you very much, Colette and Frances for joining us. So I also, on behalf of our President Melissa Lang, I'd like to welcome you to the State Society on Aging's Conversation Series for 2021. As James said, my name is Christian Gonzalez Rivera, immediate past president of SSA. So just to give you a little bit of background to SSA, for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, we were founded in 1972 as a trade association for educators in the field of gerontology. And today we continue to be a gathering place for New York's academic gerontology community. And we've expanded our membership to include many other people who are working on behalf of older New Yorkers, including direct service professionals, researchers, advocates, students, and policymakers in a wide variety of disciplines, ranging from public policy and urban planning, which is where my background is, to psychology and social work and many other fields. Our members work locally, statewide, nationally, and as this conversation shows, internationally as well. We're also an all-volunteer organization. So normally around this time, we'd be ramping up for our annual conference in late October, so right around now, which this year would have been held in Saratoga Springs, New York. And of course, nothing compares to seeing our colleagues and friends in person at our annual conference, but what we hope to offer instead is a series of virtual conversations with very smart and accomplished people in our field who might offer some knowledge and inspiration in this very uncertain time. So just as a reminder, all events in the SSA Conversation Series are free and open to the public, so feel free to invite others. And we're also a membership organization, and we love new members. So if you're not yet a member, please consider joining us. You can join us as an individual or as an organization, and there are discounts for older adults and students. We keep the rates very affordable, so check out our membership page on our website, which is ssany.org. And I put it on a card to make it easier. That's ssany.org. Okay. Membership entitles you to elect board members and to join our committees where we discuss and take action on policy issues affecting older New Yorkers. And you also get a discount on our in-person annual conference, which, if we're lucky, will happen next year. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to you, James, for what promises to be a really interesting conversation. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Christian. Aging is discrimination or unjust treatment of older people based on stereotypes, unfounded attitudes and beliefs, prejudice or opinions of older people and their actions, and often promote beliefs that the world would be better without this increasingly large group of people who no longer contribute to society, not only here in America, but around the world. It is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and perhaps one of the greatest advocates for human rights of older people, Ms. Frances Zainoeddin. Upon retiring, Frances joined the Ngo Committee on Aging in New York to further promote the ideals of the United Nations with specific interests in gender and aging issues. Mrs. Zainoeddin is currently a representative to the United Nations for the International Federation on Aging. She's with me, there are 5 of us. Seroptimus International and Grey Panthers. She is the elected vice president of the Ngo Committee on Aging and is also the UN focal point in New York for the Stakeholder Group on Aging, which was established in 2013. She was part of the stakeholder group involved in sustainable development issues. She was actively engaged in the United Nations negotiation leading to the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015, which ensures the inclusion and of the concerns of older people. Without further ado, Ms. Frances Zainoeddin, presenting Ageism Around the World. Frances?
Thank you. Thank you, James, for this wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. So many people, and I'm really looking forward to it, and I really appreciate this opportunity. to discuss a few things that are happening at the global level. I want to apologize. I live in Manhattan, and the buzzing behind me is some road work. So I hope that's not going to affect. So just I think Colette is going to put the slides on the screen. And while she does this, I just wanted to say that my work at the UN has been obviously to protect the rights of older persons around the world. So it's indeed a pleasure for me to come and speak to you more at the local level. So it's a wonderful opportunity to share my experiences. Just for your information, the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York has an aging unit, a very small aging unit, but aging issues are discussed or included in programs around the United Nations the offices of the United Nations around the world, in Addis Ababa, in Bangkok, in Geneva, in Amman, and in Santiago. So my work, as is James's as well, is to monitor what's happening at the UN global level, what governments are talking about and what they're agreeing to. So a summary of my presentation, just to tell you what will be coming ahead. I will be providing some global demographic data, and then I'll have a short discussion on older persons around the world, and obviously ageism and attitudes and behaviors of what's happening at the global level, and age discrimination, and what we can do and what the UN is doing. Next slide, please. Colette, can we start the presentation?
Yes, I'm trying very hard to get it to move.
That's okay.
It seems not to want to. So let's just see what's going on. And I am pressing this button like crazy. So why don't I just stop the share for just one moment, put it back up again and see what we get, okay?
Sure.
All right.
I'm so glad I'm not doing that, because I'm always relying on other people to help me with technology.
Someone said to me once that Zoom will be Zoom. So we're gonna see how this works. And there you go.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right.
So just to let you know, the United Nations tells us that the world is aging and is one of the mega trends of the 21st century, climate change being another mega trend. So you will see on board on the screen, you know, what the current population, global population of older persons. By the way, at the UN, we talk about older persons. We don't talk about older people, because it is considered that we're addressing the rights of individuals. So the term older persons has been agreed by 193 member states. And we don't talk about elderly. That's an absolutely no word at the UN. Anyway, you can see the growth, 1.4 billion in 2030 and 2.1 billion in 2050. So that's a huge increase. Of course, it has impact on economic and social policies such as health, social security, employment, housing, education. And most older persons reside in Asia, Europe, and Northern America. While Africa is the youngest continent, the number of older persons is also increasing due to better health and economic conditions. Next slide, please. So we see here, this is a wonderful picture of a tree and all the concentric circles. You will see that persons age 65 or above outnumbered children under 5 years of age. By the way, 65 is sort of an arbitrary figure, and 60 is too, but at the UN, in order to have comparative data as they're collecting information, it's usually the definition of an older person is usually 60 or 65 and above. Although in some countries, like in Africa, for instance, many countries consider an older person as somebody above the age of 50. So we have to take that into account as well. So by 2030, which is just around the corner, 1 in 6 people will be age 60 or over. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you will have some numbers about what's happening in the US, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. By 2050, over a quarter of the population will be above the age of 60. Japan already has that number. It's huge. Take a look at that. 33.4% of Japan's population was above 60 in 2017. And by 2050, 42%. That's huge. We also know that women are living longer than men by about 5 years. And the fastest growing age cohort is the group above the age of 80. So that is amazing. And it's expected to triple from 143 million to 426 million in 2050. And I think when we talk about aging, that perhaps we should actually talk about longevity as opposed to aging. Next slide, please. Okay, now aging, we should celebrate. It is a triumph of development, medical science and healthcare. And people are living longer, people are living healthier, and people are more active. And of course, we know from history that life expectancy was nowhere where it is now. Because of famine and disease, people died very young and infant mortality was high. People died from food contamination. There was little medication. Way back then, living beyond the age of 30 was already considered a great achievement. But now, while there's still poverty and a big gap between the haves and the have-nots, people are now living longer because of advancement in science, technology, healthcare, and education. So it is something to celebrate. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Frances.
Sorry, next slide.
Again, and it
Stuck.
seems to be stuck again. Let me just see if I go back or forth. I'm sorry, I might have to stop, share, and start again. So sorry about that. See what goes on. Let's just see. This way, see what we get.
Okay, thank you. But in many countries, older persons are viewed as a burden on society. As a result of urbanization, for instance, when children go to seek their fortunes in big cities, reverence and caring for older persons by family members are fast disappearing. Around the world, we see many who grow hungry. And in fact, in the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, when governments talk about malnutrition, they actually don't talk about malnutrition of young people, children only. They actually include older persons because many older persons around the world go hungry because the food is usually given to the young. And of course, many are homeless and many are abandoned. And I'll talk about the abandonment and ostracization a little bit later. But these are some of the issues that we need to keep in mind in terms of ageism. Next slide, please. So older persons are often vulnerable to deprivation and exclusion as a result of conflict, natural disasters, and pandemics. Of course, the pandemic, COVID-19, has hit older persons the hardest. They're often the ones with pre-existing conditions. And one of the most serious challenges that's coming upon us, if not already, is homelessness. And I want to say that for the first time ever, just a couple of years ago, the United Nations started addressing homelessness. It had not addressed that particular issue before, but currently there is a UN resolution on homelessness as it is affecting all countries. Of course, as I mentioned, malnutrition, lack of access to safe drinking water, sanitation, chronic diseases, and lack of affordable medicines and treatments. I think one of the most horrendous things I had heard about the deprivation experienced by older persons, and which actually got me started on this track, was that in India, for instance, once a year, there's an annual pilgrimage to the Ganges to pay homage and thanks to the gods, etc. And families usually travel far and wide. And I heard about situations where families would bring their usually grandmothers, and because they're so poor, they leave them on the steps of the temples and not take them home. When I heard this, it was one of the triggers for me to address older persons' issues. And you can see that because of poverty and the choices people have to make, that often older persons are the ones who suffer. And older persons are probably quite willing to suffer for the younger generation, but that shouldn't be the case. And ageism should not appear in such instances. There should be enough policies and programs and legislation to protect all people from cradle to grave. In some cases, thank you, elder abuse, great. In some cases, I want to say a little bit about elder abuse because it goes beyond physical. Why often we talk about elder abuse as physical, emotional, but it also is financial and is neglect and social isolation. And of course, all of you who've been involved in aging issues are very, very familiar with this. And we have heard horror stories of cases in remote villages in Africa and India, where, for example, older women who are 60 and above are considered witches, responsible for bad harvests and illnesses in the village. And sadly, often it's family members who are the ones who inflict abuse, and the victims are too ashamed or embarrassed and fearful to report the abuse. Abuse in institutional settings, as we all know, have been well documented. So, my questions are, at what age is a person considered less valuable? That we should be without preventive health care or palliative care or adequate housing? At what age is it okay to be abandoned and ostracized? At what age should a person be less protected from discrimination, violence, and abuse? These are the questions that we actually as representatives of various non-governmental organizations at the UN, we ask member states, you know, when you're talking about discrimination, what are you talking about? Are you only talking about discrimination against women of a certain age, or is it from cradle to grave? Next slide, please. Sorry about this slide, but I wanted to show the depth of ageism in some countries. I had mentioned about women being considered witches. This event is a 92-year-old woman who was being whipped. It did not occur 20 years ago. It occurred last year in a village in Ghana, where she was whipped because she was accused of being a witch. You can see the people, look at the groups of people hanging around. It's unconscionable. Fortunately, the accusers were arrested and charged. But when you look at a photo like this, you can see that it's accepted. Nobody's rushing up to help her. This cannot be tolerated. And in fact, I want everybody to know that witchcraft is so prevalent that the Human Rights Council has a resolution calling on member states to prevent and combat witchcraft. I mean, what sort of world do we live in when we have to deal with this? So it's really horrendous, and it's very difficult to see and understand. And the Office of the Human Rights High Commissioner has a section that actually deals with such issues. What are we coming to as humankind when we have to tolerate this sort of thing? Good. Now, ageism, wonderful. And as everybody knows already, what Robert Butler said way back in 1969, you can read this on the screen. And I think a wonderful way of putting, explaining ageism is something that Professor Todd Nelson from California had said. It's a prejudice against our future selves. You know, we often talk about intergenerational collaboration, etc. We need to tell the younger ones that whatever is being done to help the older persons, the older generation, is going to help them. Everybody grows old. That's one thing that we can be sure of. And in terms of ageism, and I think many of you probably have read Ashton Applewhite's book and her work in ageism, where, you know, semantics is also important. You know, senior, as Washington Post Abigail Trafford said, you know, is laden with stereotypes. It conjures up dangers, discounts, decline, and dysfunction. And we have to change that around. And at the UN, we are talking about, you know, the older persons should be an issue that is a human rights issue rather than just an issue of medical rehabilitation and social welfare. And I'll get to that in a little while. As I mentioned before, we should be talking about longevity. So, yeah, ageism is not a new phenomenon, and it's accepted everywhere, and it goes unchallenged. And the World Health Organization has come out with a report to say it is more prevalent than sexism and racism. And it is the only ism that affects all of us. And of course, as we all know, COVID has exposed this even more. It's been around, but COVID has highlighted and exacerbated the issue. I want to say that when governments introduce health measures, during emergency situations like COVID-19. They cannot discriminate based on age. In many countries, older persons were completely barred from leaving their homes, even though lockdown measures were supposed to protect older persons from COVID. Older persons were denied access to their regular healthcare services. Some had to lie about their age and say they were younger in order to get medical attention, particularly in triage facilities. In some cases, those who did get COVID-19 were basically left to die because of their age. And the attitude is they are going to die anyway. For some older persons, there was limited access to non-COVID treatments and palliative care. Home care services were curtailed, social services were unavailable. I want to say something. A cousin of mine who is 82 was at the beginning of COVID was called, he lived in England, he lives in England, he was called by his doctor and asked whether if he contracted COVID and was admitted to hospital, would he be willing to forego treatment? At which point, Philip almost screamed down the phone, "Hell no, I'm expecting to live for another 10 or 15 years. While it was, at least he was contacted for him to have a say. They recognize his independence and autonomy, but nevertheless, just because of his age, not because of any health issues, other health issues he might have, but because of his age, hospitals and doctors were willing to approach individuals to give up living, basically. It is, of course, the crisis in nursing homes, of course, is unacceptable. As everybody knows, in Canada, 80% of COVID-19 deaths occurred in nursing homes. And some older persons were even blamed for the spread of the pandemic. The basic issue is that taking away the rights and privileges and lives of one social group to benefit another social group is a human rights violation. And this clearly reflects the failure of the health system to address emergency situations. We must all advocate to ensure that adequate disaster preparedness is in place in future. So the Global Report on Ageism, the World Health Organization has recognized that this is a huge, huge problem. They have an actual campaign to combat ageism. And later on, I have the websites for you to access to find out more about the campaign. It was found that 50% of the people worldwide are ageist. Against the young and old, although ageism against the young was more prevalent in Europe, funnily enough, but everywhere else, older persons were the ones who suffered the most. According to the Global Report on Ageism, ageism refers to stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. In terms of institutional ageism, that refers to the various laws, rules, and social norms, medical decisions taken based on age as opposed to the ailment. I love the story that I was told by a woman who said that an older woman who went to her doctor to complain about her sore knee. And the doctor had said to her, at your age, you should expect to have pain in your knee. And the woman said, but I don't have pain in the other knee, and it's the same age. So you know, it's the sort of thing that the medical profession perpetuates, because they're looking at the age as opposed to treating the ailment. So we need to pay particular attention to that. And of course, older persons are very often excluded from clinical trials in order to know what is best for older persons. And there's a whole list of issues which I'm sure you're very familiar with in New York, but it happens all around the world. You know, the workplaces, discrimination at work, older persons are less likely to be interviewed, much less hired. There are fewer training opportunities. And of course, there's in many countries, there's the mandatory retirement age, even at the UN, by the way, which speaks about human rights. And of course, the attitudes of healthcare workers, financial institutions, you know, there's so many places where ageism abounds. Omissions in data collection, I want to just highlight that at the UN, up until recently, data was collected on violence against women from the ages of 15 to 49, which was considered the reproductive years. But after 49, there was nothing. And, you know, elder abuse abounds. And so, as James had mentioned, we were involved in the Sustainable Development Goals. So we managed to lobby to remove the age cap, to go beyond 49 years of age to collect data. So, you know, we have to keep pushing and pushing for so long. Many years, we have to keep pushing to make sure that governments around the world are paying attention to this. And it's really interesting because, you know, when you see a lot of delegates from different countries participating at meetings, they're not always young. You would think some of the older ones would be alert to this, but very often they think about the dollars and cents. What will it cost, instead of an investment to prevent cases of serious chronic conditions? They're just talking about a cost, older persons as a cost, but children are a cost, teenagers are a cost, but for some reason, older persons are totally neglected. And of course, on this slide, as we all know, it's not just a question about insults or impatience and avoidance and, you know, excluding us, people making comments in the media and jokes. For me, these are all superficial. Some of them, you know, jokes, some of them are funny. I make jokes about myself as well. But it's when it becomes insidious, that's when we have to pay attention. So next slide, please. So ageism is also about the harmful repercussions. As you see, the poorer physical and mental health, increased risky health behavior, depression, lack of interest. You know, so often we hear, she's too old to, or we say it of ourselves, I'm too old to. I'm too old to bother, I'm too old to change. We have to change all that. Ageism is very judgmental because it means judging someone because of their age. I mentioned the story about the aches and pains of a woman's right knee. A doctor judging and talking about her age as opposed to the pain in her knee. I mean, how many football players have pains in their knees? Is their age raised at the time of treatment? What about forgetfulness? For those of us who have children, how many times we've heard, Mom, I've forgotten where are my keys? Where are the books? Where are my sneakers? And of course, so often we are always judged because we have a lack of understanding of modern technology. Of course, where is lifelong learning? Why aren't we discussing lifelong learning? And of course, the media, the business, they talk about our appearance as appearances that we always should be thinking about. Anti-aging. Sorry, aging is part of life. We don't want to be anti-aging at any stage. Okay. So we want to focus on older persons as an issue of human rights rather than of medical rehabilitation and social welfare. Next slide, please. I think I have to move a little bit faster. So at the UN, we often talk about international action is necessary when national action is inadequate. I want to say that we in the United States are very, very lucky. We have different legislation, we have different programs, we have senior centers. While there's room for improvement, we are very, very lucky. I'm a very lucky person. I have a pension. I have a roof over my head. I have health insurance, and I can get by, but many, many people around the world don't have any of that. So next slide, please. So here, and I think I'm not going to go through it all, but at the global level, we have various international agreements where older persons are mentioned. And the World Health Organization, of course, has just adopted the Decade of Healthy Aging. And they also have age-friendly cities program. I urge all of you to access the World Health Organization website to find out about this. And there are a number of cities, and I think New York City has applied and is trying to be considered an age-friendly city. But there are a number of cities around the US that are considered age-friendly cities. Next slide, please. So we had mentioned the sustainable goals before, and this will be just a very quick run through with this one, I'm sorry, where we have a number of places where the member states, the governments talk about a society for all ages. Of course, a lot of governments don't know what all ages mean. And that's what our advocacy role is about, to ensure from 0 to whatever age. So we do a lot of lobbying and we attend meetings to make sure that governments, we sort of pop up whenever we're allowed to speak, pop up and put our hand up and, call attention to older persons' rights. So we're kept quite busy. Next slide, please. So one of the things that, while we have all these programs, why are we fighting for an international legal instrument, which is called a convention, like the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, like the Convention for the Rights of the Child, like the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? We are now fighting for a convention to protect the rights of older persons. And there's an open-ended working group which meets every year. They've met 11 times already, but they have not decided whether to go ahead with this. Many organizations, including the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older Persons, are advocating very strongly to have a convention. The Human Rights Council actually appointed a special independent expert that will look into this for us. So age is not recognized as a category of discrimination. in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, we talk about gender, race, ethnicity, language, religion, but not age. So as we all know, we've been through this before, there are gaps in the protection of older persons in existing human rights and standards. There are gaps in terms of autonomy and independence of older persons. There are gaps about violence and neglect and abuse against older persons. And of course, social protection issues, health issues, and access to justice. Next slide, please. So the added value of a convention is that it actually helps standardize what already exists. You know, there are 193 countries that are all different understanding of what long-term care means, what even an older person means. And we are hoping that a convention will codify the rights and standardize the language. And it will require governments to collect data. And it will also require governments to report on implementation. And like, I mean, I think we all realize what the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities did for the disabilities group. It affected everybody. And we were made much more aware of the abilities and rights of persons with disabilities. And the convention at the UN was actually based on the United States Persons with Disabilities Act. The United States has not ratified it, but it certainly implements most of the provisions in that. And of course, the whole aim is to create a society for all ages, from cradle to grave. So I'll rush through this a little bit because so there are different conventions which I mentioned already. Next page, please. So the role of non-governmental organizations, and I have the websites of these key organizations that are following aging issues at the UN. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I will basically end on this. I've been talking a lot about the negative things that have happened to older persons and what governments need to do, but we mustn't forget that there are many, many older persons who lead an active, vibrant, productive life, contributing to their families, their communities, and to the national economy. And this is one of the things that we're trying to stress to governments, that, you know, and we vote. We're active. Many of us are. Some need more care, but we can't ignore the ones who make are still making contributions to society. And we want all a society for all ages, no matter their economic and social situation, wherever they live, to lead a life of dignity. Old age is a present for some people and the future of all of us. And I can't help, as a new US citizen, I'm actually from Australia, but I'm a fan of the Yankees. And Yogi Berra used to say, "It ain't over till it's over." And remember, it ain't over till it's over. Until our dying breath, we have the right to live with dignity. Thank you so much.
James?
I thought you were going to handle this. We have time for one or two questions.
Right.
Are there any questions? You can put questions in the chat, or let's see. No one has put anything in the chat as yet for a question.
Well, you know what, James? We do have a couple of questions So I'd like to ask a couple of questions to Frances, because there might be some people in the audience interested in becoming more involved in these efforts. And Frances, I wondered if you could tell us some of the ways we can do that.
Yes, first of all, as I was speaking, I felt that I'm really preaching to the converted. Everybody who's here knows so much, and much more than I do. I'm not a gerontologist, or I'm just an advocate, basically. But I think if you belong to organizations that are concerned about older persons around the world, please contact the Ngo Committee on Aging, and I've put the website up there, or contact James because he's a member. So the Ngo Committee on Aging in New York comprises members, NGOs who are interested in global issues. And they have a special status where they can attend meetings and speak on behalf of older persons. And the NGO Committee on Aging also has events about what's happening around the world. And we usually have about 9 events a year, including the celebration of International Day of Older Persons, which is 1 October. So I would really encourage all your organizations to do something every year on 1st of October and celebrate older persons.
Actually, SSA did. I sent the notice to them, and a lot of the people who are here now saw the announcement and went online to the October 1st.
Frances, we have one more question. We know that there are a lot of myths about aging, and we also know, as you have described for us, they can be extremely stigmatizing. So what can we do? What more can we do to minimize those risks?
I think we need to call them out. We need to be vocal. I tend not to, I shouldn't, but I tend to ignore sort of personal slights. One of the things that I hate is being called a deer. A few people when I'm walking, and I feel I walk upright, I don't have a cane, I'm pretty, and then, somebody in the supermarket, maybe because of my white hair, oh, thanks, dear, and it's sort of I feel is in a slightly condescending way, because would they say that to a younger person? I don't know, perhaps, but I try to ignore that type of thing. But I think in terms of programs, in terms of what's happening in nursing homes, in our own work, we need to pay attention and draw attention. We can't say this. We can't talk about the elderly. We can't talk about frailty. We need to talk about people as human beings with rights. Whether you're 10, 20, 60, 80, 95. And we need to pay attention to that. And we need to also listen to older persons' voices. Very often as advocates, we talk on their behalf. And the Global Alliance for the Protection of Rights of Older Persons is trying very hard, actually, to bring in more voices of older persons as individuals. So we have to monitor actions, laws, codes, building codes, whatever it is. We have to be vigilant, and we have to keep an eye. It's not just about taking care of older persons, which is extraordinarily important. But we need to recognize their full participation in society.
We also have someone who's asking for a number for your NGO committee.
There's no number, Colette, but there is. I can give
contact.
I can give you a contact. Mailman MAILMAN at NGOCOA-NY.org. Again, mailman at NGOCOA-NY.org. And they will be extremely happy to hear from you and will gladly send you a membership and dues form.
And we're getting just a number of people in the audience thanking you, Frances, for an excellent, excellent presentation.
Well, on behalf of the State Society on Aging of New York, Colette and myself as part of the Diversity Committee, we really want to thank you, Frances, for presenting this to us this morning. It's a shame that we didn't have more time because I'm sure that we could go on and discuss this for at least another hour or more. I'm sure that people are interested in why and how do they go about being a part of the convention. And so we'd like to hear more about that, but unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you all very much. Thank you for participating and attending this conference, and look forward to other events from SSA, which will be coming to you very soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.